Story 1. The Girl in the Bathroom. It all started with a story, a rumor whispered among the students that reached me for the first time on a cold October morning. I was in my last year of high school, and although I had always been skeptical about the paranormal, the urban legends of the school never ceased to arouse my curiosity. This particular story, however, was different. It felt more vivid, more real. It was the story of Maria, the girl from the Maria bathroom. Maria had been a student at our school many years ago. She was a shy girl with a pale face and big dark eyes, always with a book in her hand. Nobody knew much about her. It was as if she vanished into the crowd. Some said she lived with her grandmother. Others that her parents had died in an accident. Yes, however, everyone agreed that Maria had a sadness that enveloped her like a perpetual fog. One afternoon during recess, Maria disappeared. Nobody saw her leave school, and her belongings were left intact on her desk. After hours of searching, they found her in one of the bathrooms on the 3rd floor, the oldest in the building. There was water all over the floor, and the lights flickered intermittently. Maria was there in one of the cubicles, motionless and cold. No one knew exactly what happened to her, but it was said that she drowned, although there was no logical explanation for it. Since then, the 3rd floor bathroom was closed, but the rumors persisted. The students claimed that they heard whispers and the sound of running water when they passed by. Some said they saw their reflection in the mirrors, her large dark eyes looking at them with a mixture of sadness and reproach. I never believed those stories until one night, long after the sun had set, I decided to stay at school to finish a project. I knew I would be the only one there, and the idea of having the entire library to myself was too tempting to pass up. As the hours progressed, the silence of the school became almost palpable. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty hallways, and the fluorescent light of the library seemed to flicker with every movement. I had finished most of my work when I felt the need to go to the bathroom. Without thinking much, I headed to the 3rd floor bathroom since it was closer to the library. I had completely forgotten the stories about Maria. When I arrived, I noticed that the bathroom door was ajar. I pushed it gently, and a shiver ran down my spine. Hearing the creaking of the hinges, the bathroom lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I walked to one of the sinks and turned on the faucet to wash my hands. The water was freezing cold, and for a moment, I thought I could hear a slight murmur among the sound of the running water. When I looked up, I saw something that made my heart stop. For a second, reflected in the mirror behind me was the figure of a little girl. It was Maria. Her dark eyes stared at me, filled with an unfathomable sadness. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I looked back at the mirror, and she was gone. A cold sweat covered my forehead as I tried to rationalize what I had seen. It must have been exhaustion, I told myself. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I decided it was time to leave, but as I turned to the door, I saw it slowly close by itself with a dry and definitive sound. Panic took hold of me as I tried to open the door, but the knob was cold and wouldn't move. I knocked on the door hard, calling for someone, anyone, even though I knew there was no one at school at that hour. It was then that I heard the sound, a soft shrill that seemed to fill the air around me. I turned slowly, and there she was, in the corner of the bathroom with her dress soaked and her eyes fixed on me. I tried to speak, but my voice got caught in my throat. Maria began to slowly approach. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the wet floor. Each step she took seemed to echo in my head, and panic paralyzed me. I knew I had to do something, but my body didn't respond. When she was a few steps away from me, I could see the tears running down her pale cheeks. "Why can't I rest?" she whispered in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Her question hit me like a hammer. What could I say to her? How could I help a spirit trapped in a place of so much pain and sadness? I tried to gather the courage to speak. "I don't know," I answered with difficulty. "What do you need to rest?" Her eyes seemed to darken even more, and for a moment, I thought she was going to drag me into her world of eternal pain. But then her look changed. There was a mix of hope and despair in her eyes. "You must find my diary," she said. It's on my desk, the one by the window in the art room." With those words, Maria disappeared, and the bathroom door swung open. I ran out of there with my heart about to explode. I ran to the art room, the oldest and most forgotten place in the school. Everything was covered in dust, and the tables and chairs were arranged as if time had stopped. I looked for the desk by the window and, after a few moments of searching, I found an old notebook hidden in the bottom compartment. I opened it and found the last pages written in small, shaky handwriting. Maria had written about her sadness, her loneliness, and her desires to escape the suffering that consumed her. On the last page, she spoke of someone who tormented her, someone who followed her and would not leave her alone. I took the diary with me, determined to give Maria a break. I didn't know how, but I felt I had to try. I returned to the third-floor bathroom with the diary in my hands. As I entered, the air became even colder, and the murmur of the water was louder than ever. In the center of the bathroom, I opened the diary. "Maria," I called, my voice trembling. "I have your diary." She appeared again, this time with a look of relief. "Thank you," she whispered, and for a moment, her figure became clearer. "Read it out loud, please." I began to read each word, echoing off the cold walls of the bathroom. As I read, it felt like a heavy burden was lifted from its place. The atmosphere became less oppressive, and the murmur of the water began to cease. When I reached the last page, I looked up and saw Maria. Her eyes, once filled with sadness, now seemed calm. "Thank you," her voice repeated, barely a whisper. "Now I can rest." With those words, Maria slowly faded away, leaving behind only a feeling of peace. The bathroom felt different, lighter, as if a dark presence had been expelled. I walked out of there with my heart still beating strongly, but knowing that I had done something important. The next day, the school was filled with rumors about what had happened. Some said they had seen a strange light coming from the third floor, others that they had heard the sound of a girl singing. But for me, what mattered was that finally, I had found the peace I was looking for. I never saw Maria's ghost again, but every time I pass by the bathroom on the third floor, I feel a strange calm, like a whisper in the wind that tells me that everything is okay. Maria's story became something more than a simple rumor. It became a reminder that even in the darkest places, there is always hope for those who seek rest. And so, the girl in the bathroom at my school stopped being a tormented ghost, becoming a legend of redemption and peace that lives on in the hallways and in the hearts of those who remember her story. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos and like and share with your friends. My name is Peter, and I remember that I was 13 years old when the most terrifying event of my life occurred. It was a time when the innocence of childhood began to fade, and the first years of adolescence brought with them new challenges and fears. I studied in a small elementary school in a quiet neighborhood, a place that had always been a refuge of laughter and games until everything changed. In my class, there was a boy named Daniel. Daniel was different from the others. He was a quiet child, always isolated in his own world. The other children used to make fun of him, calling him weird and strange. I never understood why. Daniel never did anything bad to me, and I often found myself feeling sorry for him. Maybe that's why, out of all his classmates, I was the only one who didn't bother him. However, for some reason, I didn't get close to him. There was something in his gaze, a deep sadness and a loneliness that I couldn't fully understand. It all started when Daniel started talking about his imaginary friend. At first, no one paid much attention to him. After all, many children have imaginary friends. But the way Daniel talked about him was different. It wasn't a simple game or a childish fantasy for him. His imaginary friend was real, very real. I remember one day in particular. We were at recess, and Daniel was sitting alone in a corner of the playground. I approached him to see how he was feeling. Maybe he needed a friend. "Hello, Daniel," I said with a smile. He looked up, and for a moment, I saw a flash of fear in his eyes before it dissipated. "Hello, Peter," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you want to meet my friend?" Something in his tone made me shudder, but I nodded anyway. Daniel pointed into the empty space next to him. "He's here," he said. "His name is Asa." The name made me feel a chill, but I tried to keep my composure. "Hello, Asa," I said, feeling a little foolish. Daniel smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. From that day on, things started to get strange. Daniel started to change. He became more reserved, more isolated. But the most disturbing thing was the way disturbing events started to happen at school. They started as little things. Desks that moved on their own, books falling off shelves for no apparent reason, and unexplained whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. One afternoon, while we were in math class, Daniel started mumbling to himself. At first, I thought he was just talking to himself, but I soon realized that wasn't the case. He was talking to Asa. His voice was low and urgent, as if he was receiving instructions. Suddenly, Daniel got up from his seat and walked over to the window. The teacher asked him to go back to his place, but he didn't answer. With an empty look in his eyes, he opened the window and climbed onto the edge. The classroom burst into screams, and the teacher ran towards him. But Daniel jumped. He fell 2 stories and miraculously survived with only a few fractures. But when they asked him why he did it, he only answered, "Asa told me to." Daniel's parents were called, and there were endless meetings with psychologists and counselors. No one could understand what was going on. Daniel was suspended from school for a while, and we all thought that would be the end of the strange incidents. However, things only got worse when Daniel returned. He was no longer the same. His eyes, before filled with sadness, now reflected something dark and sinister. He seemed to always be talking to Asa, and his behavior became more and more erratic and violent. The teachers and students began to fear him. One night, I woke up from a disturbing dream. I had heard a whisper, a man's voice, "Asa." At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent. I got out of bed and looked out the window. There, under the pale light of the moon, I saw Daniel standing in the garden of my house. He was looking towards my window, his eyes shining with a terrifying intensity. I quickly went down the stairs and went out into the garden. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" I asked with a trembling voice. He just looked at me and smiled, a smile that had nothing human. "Asa wants you to come with us," he said. "He says that you can be our friend too." I tried to reason with him. I tried to take him back to his house, but Daniel didn't listen to me. Instead, he started reciting strange words in a language I didn't recognize. The air around us turned cold, and I felt a dark presence approaching. At that moment, my father came out of the house and saw what was happening. "Peter, come in right now," he shouted. Daniel stood still for a moment, and then, as if he had realized something, he ran and disappeared into the darkness. The following days were a mix of fear and confusion. Daniel did not return to school, and soon we found out that he had been admitted to a psychiatric institution. Rumors said that he kept talking to Asa, who said that his imaginary friend was a demon that wanted to take him to the other side. Time passed, but the memories of those dark days never faded. Even now, years later, I can feel Asa's presence in my dreams, whispers calling to me from the darkness. Daniel never left the institution. Some say he lost his sanity. Others believe his soul was claimed by the demon he once called friend. I will never forget what happened. The school closed soon after, and the building was abandoned, a grim reminder of the horrors we had witnessed. But the story of Daniel and his demonic friend lives on in my memory, a warning that sometimes what we imagine can become very, very real. My name is Donald James, and I was an exchange teacher at a small rural school in the south of the United States. This is the story of how, in a short period of time, my life was changed forever because of a student possessed by a dark and evil force. What began as an exciting opportunity to explore new cultures and teaching methods turned into a terrifying experience that left me with deep scars. I arrived in the village of San Andres in September, a picturesque community surrounded by hills and forests. The people were friendly and welcoming, and I quickly felt accepted. The school was small, with barely 100 pupils, most of whom came from local families who had lived in the region for generations. My first few days at school passed without incident. The students were respectful, although somewhat reserved. One of them, in particular, caught my attention from the first moment. A boy called Mark. He was a young man of about 15 years old, thin and deep, almost gloomy. He didn't talk much, but there was something about him that unsettled me, a feeling that something wasn't right. As the weeks went by, I began to notice strange behavior in Mark. He would often stare into space, muttering to himself in a language I didn't recognize. His classmates avoided him and seemed scared of him, although I didn't know exactly why. I tried to approach him, talk to him, but every time I did, I felt a kind of invisible barrier, a coldness that made my hair stand on end. One afternoon after school, I stayed at the school to prepare the lessons for the next day. The school was empty and silent, except for the occasional creak of wood and the whistle of the wind through the loosely closed windows. As I looked over some papers, I heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. It was a barely audible whisper, but disturbing enough to make me get up and check. I walked down the dark hallway, feeling a chill run down my spine. The light of twilight filtered through the windows, creating long, sinister shadows. As I reached the end of the hallway, I saw that the door to Mark's classroom was ajar. Cautiously, I approached and pushed the door open. Mark was standing there in the middle of the classroom, with his eyes closed and arms outstretched. He was muttering something in that strange language I had heard before. The air around him seemed to vibrate, and a feeling of oppression tightened my chest. As I opened my mouth to call out to him, his eyes flew open, and I froze by the intensity of his gaze. Suddenly, everything in the classroom began to shake. The desks and chairs moved as if an invisible force pushed them. An icy cold filled the room, and Mark's whisper turned into a guttural and heartbreaking scream. I couldn't move or look away from his eyes, which were now completely black, without a trace of white in them. Terror invaded me, and without knowing how, I managed to back away and run out of the classroom. I closed the door behind me and ran down the hall, feeling that something dark and evil was following me closely. When I finally got to my car, my hands were shaking so much that it was hard for me to put the key in the ignition. I drove back to my house with my heart beating wildly and my mind full of questions and fears. That night, I barely slept. The images of Mark and the classroom, possessed by an inexplicable force, kept repeating in my mind. The next day, I went to talk to the school principal, Mr. Garcia. I tried to explain to him what I had seen, but his reaction was skeptical. He told me that Mark had always been a problematic boy, but what I described sounded more like a nightmare than reality. I decided to investigate on my own. I spoke to some of the other teachers and the parents of the students. Most of them seemed reluctant to talk about Mark, and the few who did warned me that there were old stories about his family, stories of witchcraft and dark pacts. Some believed that I was cursed, but no one wanted to delve into the subject. The more I investigated, the more isolated I felt. I began to notice changes in my own behavior. I slept poorly, had recurring nightmares, and felt a constant presence around me, as if something was watching me. My classes suffered, and the students began to sense my restlessness. One Friday afternoon, when the school was empty again, I decided to face my fears and return to Mark's classroom. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. Armed with a flashlight and a Bible that I had found in the school library, I walked down the dark hallway, determined to confront the darkness. When I got to the classroom, the door was closed. I took a deep breath and swung it open. The room was in semi-darkness, but there was no trace of Mark. I moved forward slowly, illuminating every corner with the flashlight. The air was charged with an unhealthy energy, and the cold was even more intense than the previous time. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and the flashlight flickered before it went out completely. I was left in total darkness, with the Bible clenched in my trembling hands. Then, I heard the same guttural murmur, this time louder and closer. I felt a cold breath on my neck and a whisper that said my name, Javier. Panic took hold of me, but I managed to turn the flashlight back on. I turned quickly, and there was Mark with that dark and empty look, but he wasn't alone. A grotesque and amorphous shadow loomed over him like an extension of his own darkness. I tried to pray, but the words choked me in my throat. Mark advanced towards me, his movements unnatural as if an invisible force controlled him. I stepped back until I hit the wall. The shadow lengthened, covering him. Marcos fell to the ground, unconscious, and the darkness seemed to dissipate. I took advantage of the moment and ran out of the classroom, leaving Mark and the entity that possessed him behind. That night, I went to the only place where I thought I could find help: the town church. The priest, an older man with a wise look, listened to me attentively. When I finished my story, he nodded gravely and told me he was the first to face that darkness. The church had kept records of similar cases, but no one had found a definitive solution. The priest and I decided to exorcise Mark. We gathered everything we needed: holy water, crucifixes, and candles. We went to his house, where his desperate parents allowed us to enter. We found Mark in his room, chained to the bed to prevent him from hurting himself. His eyes were black, and his skin pale as wax. The ritual began, and the atmosphere became even heavier. The priest prayed in Latin, sprinkling holy water on Mark, who writhed and screamed in multiple and dehumanized voices. The room was filled with a nauseating smell, and an invisible force hit the priest, throwing him against the wall. I took the crucifix and continued the ritual, praying with all my strength. I felt a cold hand grab my arm, but I did not stop. The fight lasted what seemed like an eternity until finally, with a final scream, the shadow vanished, and Mark was silent, exhausted, and free from possession. Although we had managed to free Mark, the aftermath of that experience haunts me to this day. I left teaching and returned to my hometown, but the memories of those dark days in San Andres still present in my nightmares. Mark recovered physically, but his mind was never the same. The village remains silent about what happened, as if by not talking about it, they could forget the darkness that once stalked them. This is my story, the story of a teacher who faced the inexplicable and the evil. The experience left me marked for life, and although I try to move on, I know that there are things in this world that go beyond our understanding, and that some horrors cannot be forgotten. My name is Hector, and I have always been skeptical about the supernatural. I did not consider myself a person prone to believe in ghosts or spirits, but there are experiences that can break even the strongest barriers of disbelief. This is one of those stories. It all started last winter when I accepted a job teaching literature at a high school in New York City. It was not anyone's first choice, but I needed the job and accepted without hesitation. The institution had an old and somewhat oppressive air. Its hallways always seemed dark, and the classrooms, despite being full of students, felt empty. My first days were relatively normal, although it was difficult for me to adapt to the gloomy atmosphere. It was one night while I was correcting exams in my small and lonely office when the first strange event occurred. I felt a chill run down my spine, and when I looked up, I saw a female figure in the corner of the room, barely illuminated by the dim light of the desk. Her features were indistinguishable, and in a blink, she disappeared. My heart raced, but I dismissed the vision as a play of light and shadows, something that my mind had invented. The following days, however, the apparitions became more frequent and increasingly disturbing. Always the same figure, always disappearing before I could get close. My mental health began to deteriorate. I slept little and ate barely what was necessary. It was then that I decided to investigate a little more about the school. What I discovered was as disturbing as the visions. A few years ago, a student named Natalia had mysteriously disappeared. She was a brilliant young woman, loved by all. The last time she was seen was during a tutorial with one of her teachers. The official investigation concluded that she had run away, but many at the school whispered that something much more sinister had occurred. I couldn't help but relate these stories to my own experiences. I began to investigate deeper, talking to former employees and students. Little by little, a disturbing image emerged. The teacher with whom Natalia was last seen had a reputation for being a strict and severe man with a dark temperament. One night, while I was going through old files in the school library, the temperature of the room dropped sharply. I felt a presence behind me, and when I turned, there she was, clearer than ever. Her face, although pale and tragic, was now recognizable. Her lips moved, but she made no sound. However, I felt her words echoing in my mind. "Help me." Determined to unravel the truth, I continued digging, focusing on the professor's records. I found notes and journals that mentioned his obsession with perfection and his uncontrolled anger when his expectations were not met. The pieces began to fit together. She had been one of his best students, but something had gone wrong. Perhaps a confrontation, an argument that ended in tragedy. One afternoon, as I was walking through the school grounds, I found an old wooden door at the end of a barely used hallway. The lock was rusty, but with a little effort, I managed to open it. The door led to a small, forgotten basement, full of dust and cobwebs. At the bottom of the stairs, in a dark corner, there was a lump covered by a tarp. When I removed it, what I saw made my blood run cold. The remains of a body, now skeletal but clearly human. Among the bones, a necklace with the name Natalia engraved on it. I called the police immediately. The investigation was quick and conclusive. The DNA confirmed that the remains were Natalia's. The professor was arrested. Her journals and notes were enough evidence to connect the dots. She confessed under the pressure of the evidence and the guilt accumulated during years. With the case solved, I thought that everything was over. However, a last visit from Natalia made me understand that there was still something pending. Her spirit appeared once again, but this time not at school but in my own home. Her figure was more serene, almost grateful. I felt an indescribable peace when I saw her, and then I understood her soul could finally rest. That night I dreamed of her. In my dream, Natalia was in an open field full of light. She turned to me and smiled before disappearing over the horizon. When I woke up, I felt that an immense burden had been lifted from my shoulders. Natalia's case was a tragedy that should never have happened, but at least her soul found the peace it deserved. As for me, I am no longer the same. The experience changed me deeply. I am no longer skeptical about the supernatural, but more importantly, I am aware of the shadows that can hide behind the most respectable facades. Today, as I write these lines, Natalia's story resonates in my mind. Her spirit, although already at peace, reminds me that evil can hide in the most unsuspected places, and that sometimes the living need help as much as the dead. My name is Juan, and what I'm about to tell you is a story that has marked my life in a way I would have never imagined. It all started in my last year of high school in an old building that had always had a sinister reputation in our small town. It was a school built in the early 20th century, with long dark hallways and high ceilings that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. Despite the rumors, I had always thought they were just stories to scare new students. I remember one of those stories was about a girl named Elisa, who had supposedly died under strange circumstances at the school decades ago. According to legend, her spirit still roamed the halls, seeking revenge for her unjust death. No one knew for sure how she had died, but the details were never clear. Some versions spoke of an accident, others of a suicide, and the darkest ones suggested a murder. One October night, after a long day of studying, I decided to stay a little longer in the library to review for an important exam. I was alone, and the silence was so deep I could hear the creaking of the old wooden beams. The light was dim, barely enough to read, and the air was heavy with a musty smell of old books. Around 9 p.m., I decided it was time to leave. While I was gathering my things, I heard a dull sound coming from the hallway. I thought maybe some other student had also stayed late, but when I left the library, there was no one there. Alone, the echo of my own footsteps accompanied my walk. The building was shrouded in an eerie darkness, and the feeling of being watched made my hair stand on end. I hurriedly stepped towards the exit, but something stopped me. A barely audible whisper, as if someone was murmuring my name. Juan. The sound seemed to come from one of the closed classrooms at the end of the hallway. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Fighting against fear, I decided to approach the classroom where the whisper seemed to come from. It was room 203, one of the oldest and less used of the school. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it, it creaked with a sound that echoed throughout the hallway. The interior was plunged into darkness, and only the moonlight coming through the windows dimly illuminated the place. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then I felt a presence. The air turned cold and heavy, and a louder whisper filled the room. "Juan, why have you come?" The voice was Elisa, but there was no one. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the corner of the room. It was a girl in an old white dress, soaked and dirty. Her hair was tangled, and her skin was pale as wax. Her eyes were black wells that absorbed the light. I knew instantly it was Elisa. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. Fear had me paralyzed. Elisa began to advance towards me, floating a few centimeters from the ground. Each step she took made the air become denser, and a fetid smell filled my lungs. When she was just a couple of meters from me, she stopped. "Why won't anyone help me?" Her voice was a lament full of sadness and despair. Gathering all the courage I could, I answered in a small voice, "How can I help you?" Elisa extended her hand towards me, and at that moment, I felt as if the whole weight of the world fell on my shoulders. Images began to flood my mind. A girl running through the halls, being chased by shadows, screams of terror, and finally, a push from the top of the stairs. I understood in that moment that Elisa had not died accidentally. She had been murdered. "Find the culprits," she whispered before disappearing. The weight lifted from my shoulders and I was able to move again. I ran out of the school, my heart about to explode. That night I couldn't sleep. The images of Elisa and her tragic death repeated themselves over and over in my head. I knew I had to do something, but I had no idea where to start. The next day, I went to the town library and began to search through the old school archives. I found several articles about Elisa's death. According to the reports, she had fallen down the stairs from the second floor and had died instantly. The case had been closed as a tragic accident, but I knew the truth. I began to ask the oldest teachers if they remembered anything about the case. Most of them didn't want to talk about it, as if it were a forbidden subject. But one of the teachers, Mr. Gutierrez, told me something interesting. According to him, Elisa was a very talented girl, but also very lonely. Her classmates treated her badly and made her the object of constant mockery. He also mentioned a group of students who used to pick on her. Determined to unearth the truth, I began to investigate those students. Most of them no longer lived in the town, but I managed to find one of them, Luis, who was now a middle-aged man working in a local store. I went to talk to him. Although at first he was reluctant, he finally confessed what had happened. Luis and his group of friends used to harass Elisa. One night after school, they decided to give her a scare. They chased her through the hallways to the second floor, where one of them, in a fit of rage, pushed her down the stairs. When they saw what they had done, they panicked and ran away, leaving the case to be closed as an accident. With this information, I went to the police, but given the time that had passed and the lack of concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. However, I knew I had done the right thing by exposing the truth. That night, I went back to school. I knew I had to tell Elisa that her story had been told and that those responsible had been revealed. I walked through the dark hallways to room 203 and waited. The air turned cold again, and I felt her presence. "Elisa, I know what happened to you. I found them. I told your story," I said, my voice trembling in the darkness. Suddenly, the figure of Elisa appeared in front of me. But this time, her expression was different. She no longer looked like a vengeful specter, but a sad and grateful girl. "Thank you, Juan," she said, and for a moment, a sad smile appeared on her face before slowly fading into nothingness. From that night on, school never felt the same again. The whispers ceased, and the heavy atmosphere disappeared. Elisa's story was no longer a simple rumor. It had become a known truth. Although her death was still a tragedy, at least her spirit had found peace. I, for one, never stayed late at school again. The experience marked me deeply and taught me that sometimes ghost stories are more than simple tales. They are memories of lost souls who only seek justice and peace. I will never forget Elisa and the chill of that night. Her memory accompanies me, and every time I pass by the old school building, I can't help but feel a mixture of sadness and relief. The truth may be terrifying, but it is necessary to free those who were trapped in time. Peter Douglas had always been a methodical and dedicated teacher at Maplewood Elementary School. His days passed between math classes, homework corrections, and the incessant activity of the children on the playground. But one afternoon, after the last student had gone home and the sunlight was beginning to decline, Peter experienced something that would make him question his sanity. It was Thursday, a day like any other, except for the whispering voices he had begun to hear. At first, he thought it was the distant echo of the children still playing outside, or maybe the creaking of the old pipes in the walls of the school. But as the sound intensified, Peter could not ignore it any longer. Peter Douglas stopped in the deserted hallway, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights for company. The voices seemed to emerge from nowhere, indistinct words he could barely discern. "Hello," Peter murmured, waiting for an answer that didn't come. Intrigued and a little alarmed, he decided to follow the voices. Each step echoed in the silence of the empty school. He crossed empty hallways, passing silent classrooms with the chairs still on the desks. Finally, the voices seemed to concentrate near the end of hallway B. In front of him was an old wooden door, unusually tall for an elementary school and locked with a rusty lock. The voices seemed to emanate from behind that door. Peter hesitated for a moment, his hand shaking on the cold metal handle. With a sigh, he turned the handle and pushed the door. A stale, dusty smell greeted him immediately, along with an air colder than the rest of the building. At first, Peter couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the door, but the voices continued, clearer now, as if they were right next to him. He moved forward cautiously, looking for the source of the whispers. The space behind the door seemed to be an abandoned warehouse, full of dusty boxes and old furniture covered with faded sheets. The voices became more distinct, murmuring names that Peter thought he recognized. Names of children who had passed through the school years ago. Then, in a dark corner, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. A figure partially hidden by the shadows, a dense shadow that seemed to move independently. It had no clear form, just a dark presence that writhed and seemed to absorb the little light there was in the warehouse. Peter recoiled. His heart pounded hard in his chest. He didn't know if what he saw was real or if his mind was betraying him. He wanted to scream, but his throat closed up. The voices were now more urgent, almost demanding, as if they were trying to communicate something important. Just when Peter thought he couldn't stand it anymore, the shadow moved, not towards him, but towards an old wooden box in the opposite corner of the warehouse. It slid across the floor with inhuman slowness, as if each movement was calculated and precise. Peter continued to watch, unable to look away. The shadow seemed to be searching for something inside the box. And then, with a sudden and fluid movement, the shadow vanished, leaving only the disturbing echo of the voices that slowly faded away. Trembling and with his heart still beating uncontrollably, Peter approached the box. It was half torn apart and full of yellowed and dusty papers. Among the papers, he found an old diary, worn by time but surprisingly intact. With hands that still trembled, Peter opened the diary and began to read. The first pages spoke of a teacher who had worked at the school many decades ago. He described how he began to hear whispering voices in the hallways after school hours, voices that led him to this very warehouse, to this very box. As Peter continued reading, horror took hold of him. The teacher had tried to seal the voices but found that they only grew more persistent with time. He had begun to see shadows moving around the school. Shadows that had no physical form but that seemed to have a will of their own. The diary ended abruptly with a final entry written in a shaky scribble. "I can't stand it anymore. The shadows haunt me, even in my dreams. I must stop them before it's too late." Peter closed the journal with trembling hands. What had happened to that teacher? Had he found some way to stop the shadows? Feeling something watching him from the shadows of the warehouse, Peter suddenly turned sharply, but there was no one else there, just the silence and darkness of the abandoned warehouse with the journal pressed against his chest. Peter decided he couldn't stay in that place any longer. He walked out of the warehouse and carefully closed the door, locking it with the same rusty lock. The voices still whispered in the hallway, but they were fainter now, as if they were satisfied to have been heard. Peter walked to his desk in the teacher's lounge, his mind full of unanswered questions and his heart heavy from what he had just witnessed. He put the journal in his briefcase and made sure everything was in order before leaving the school that night. As he walked through the empty parking lot towards his car, Peter couldn't help but feel like something was following him. He turned his head quickly but saw nothing but the shadows of the trees moving in the night breeze. As he finally reached his house, he closed the door behind him. Peter sat on his couch and stared at the journal on the coffee table. He knew that what he had seen and experienced that afternoon, he couldn't easily forget, and he knew that somehow the voices and shadows were still with him, even in the silence of his own home. Since then, Peter Douglas was never the same again. Although he never mentioned what he had seen to anyone else, his mind always returned to the abandoned warehouse and the shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. And when the clock struck the late hours of the night, sometimes he would still hear the whispering voices, reminding him that the darkness is never completely empty.